President, I ask consent that call in progress be vitiated.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent the period of morning business be extended until 5 p.m. today, and that all provisions of the previous order remain in effect.
Without objection.
And Mr. President, I have one unanimous consent request for a committee to meet during today's session of the Senate. It has the approval of the majority and the minority leaders. I ask unanimous consent that this request be agreed to and that this request be printed in the record.
Without objection.
Mr. President, yesterday President Obama made a beautiful speech. I think everyone agrees that he's a very persuasive speaker. And although I didn't agree with anything he said, still it was said beautifully. I want to read one part of the speech that because I don't want to get it wrong. Thank you, Eddie. He said, quote, "We will respond to the threat of climate change knowing that the failure to do so would betray our children and future generations. The path towards sustainable energy sources will be long and sometimes difficult, but America cannot resist this transition. We must lead it. We cannot cede to other nations the technology that will power new jobs and new industries. We must claim its promise, and that's how we will maintain our economic vitality and our national treasure." Unquote. That's a direct quote that came out of the President's speech, and it's a lot of little subliminal things in there that people didn't pick up on, but I did. And one is, and they talked about, we must show the leadership. Well, that's because all the things that they try to do to damage the economy, to destroy the economy in terms of the cap and trade agenda and all that, are things that other countries are just waiting for us to do. It's not that we're going to provide the leadership and then all of a sudden China is going to say, hey, they're doing it, so maybe we ought to do it. China instead is sitting back hoping that that will happen in this country so that they can have all the jobs that are chased away from our manufacturing base. Now, there are a few sentences that the President dedicated to global warming, and the rest of his speech could be labeled as the liberal laundry list, and I think everyone was expecting that. I wasn't surprised that the President decided to do this. All during the campaign and during the weeks since the election, the President's extreme environmental base have been very vocal with their frustrations. A lot of them go back and they say, you know, at one time, Mr. President, you had the White House and you had the House and the Senate, and yet you didn't even try to get this stuff done. And they're talking, of course, about a cap and trade system. And in fact, there's one good reason he didn't get it done, and that's because the votes just aren't there. They wanted the President to immediately regulate hydraulic fracturing, officially reject the permit for Keystone Pipeline, advance the regulatory powers of the EPA, and to cut CO2 emissions and use all of its political capital to push a legislative fix to climate change and to kill America's oil and gas industry. So that's what was expected of him. And now, since he doesn't have to run for re-election, you're going to get a lot more than you did before. So that should make them happy. But it's a lot more rhetoric and not a lot more action. Studies done during the most recent debate, and that would have been the Waxman-Markey bill. That was the cap and trade bill just a couple of years ago that they had. I think that might have been the last one we had. The estimates, and this is interesting, going all the way back to the Kyoto Treaty, they said the cost if you try to do cap and trade is going to be between $300 and $400 billion a year. Well, that's $400 billion a year, and I do something in my state of Oklahoma that I suggest that the presiding officer may do in his state of West Virginia. I count every year, to get the figures, on how many families there are in my state of Oklahoma that file a federal tax return and actually pay federal taxes. Then I do the math. And the way it works out, if you're talking about $400 billion a year, and I don't think I have not had one person argue with that figure that I've been using for over 10 years now. But if you do the math, that means each person in my state of Oklahoma, it would cost them about $3,000 a year to do it. And the interesting part of this is you don't really accomplish anything by doing it. Now, this same agenda at the EPA under authority he's claiming is under the Clean Water Act is got to be something that we're going to talk about, and I don't have any hesitation in doing that. The bills like the Waxman-Markey bill And I believe Senator Boxer and several others have had bills. The cost of that being of some $400 billion a year would affect industries and emitters of CO2 that emit 25,000 tons of CO2 or more a year, 25,000 tons. Now that would truly be just the big emitters. However, the effort of this administration, since they can't get it passed through legislation, is to do it through regulation under the Clean Air Act. Now the Clean Air Act is specific, and the Clean Air Act goes after anyone who emits at least 250 tons of CO2. And that's, so stop and think about that, because it's very difficult to try to evaluate it and determine just how much it would cost. The regulations that they have would force these facilities to receive, anyone who's regulated under this, EPA construction permits, rehabilitation permits, monitoring devices, and install unnecessary and costly technology to reduce CO2 emissions without any corresponding benefits. This would give the EPA a hand in everything. The cost of this is so great that it can't be calculated. Stop and think about this. If the Waxman-Markey bill or any of the other pieces of legislation that were called cap and trade regulations were passed, that would regulate only those 25,000 tons or more of emissions. However, the Clean Air Act is 250 tons. So if 25,000 tons would be $400 billion a year, how much would it be for just 250? That means every university, every school, every hospital would be subject to the regulation. So that's something that that they've been attempting to do for a long time. You know, I hope that, I have to say this, that there are a lot of appointees of President Obama that I don't like at all. One I did like, and I'm sorry she's not staying, is Lisa Jackson. Lisa Jackson was the director appointed by Obama to be the director of the Environmental Protection Agency. And I found one thing really curious about her. While she's very liberal philosophically, she doesn't lie. You know, that's all I really can ask of people. And I remember in this case, when they finally gave up, this is just 2 years ago, they finally gave up and said, we're not going to be able to pass any kind of a bill for cap and trade, but we're going to go to Copenhagen and tell them we're going to do another way. If we can't get a bill passed, we're going to do it through regulation. Now, to do it through regulation instead of legislation, this is kind of in the weeds, but you have to have an endangerment finding. That's what the law says. So Lisa Jackson was before our committee, and I asked her the question. I said, Madam Administrator, tomorrow I'm going to leave for Copenhagen to be the one-man truth squad, because everybody's been over there lying to these other countries saying that we're going to pass something over here. And I have a feeling that once I leave town, you're going to have an endangerment finding and do this through regulation. I can see her kind of smiling. I said, when you do that, the regulation that you have is going to have to be based on science. That's what the law says. What science are you going to use? And her answer was, well, we'll use mostly the United Nations IPCC. Well, a lot of people don't realize that this thing was all, I wrote a whole book about this, that this thing all started way back 12 years ago, and it was a thing by the United Nations. They formed the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and they're the ones that came up with all of this stuff. So she said it's going to be on the IPCC. Well, poetic justice couldn't have done it better if we had planned, because it was not weeks after that, it was days after that what happened, ClimateGate. All of a sudden, they realized through some leaked information that the IPCC had been lying all those years. I want to just mention a couple of things. The UK Telegraph said it's the worst scientific scandal of our generation. Clive Cook, the Financial Times, says the stink of intellectual corruption is overpowering. The IPCC prominent physicist resigns because, quote, ClimateGate was a fraud on a scale I've never seen. Further, this is another UN scientist bails. UN IPCC coordinating author Dr. Philip Lloyd called IPCC a fraud. The result is not scientific. And the list goes on, But just stop and think about it. The UK Telegraph, that's one of the biggest publications in the UK, saying it's the worst scientific scandal of our generation. So we now know that that was the science that they were going to use, and I will always be appreciative of Director Jackson for being totally honest in her response. But we can guess that would be devastating and cripple the nation and bankrupt our economy. We know what would happen. The contrast here is stark. On one hand, you have a president saying that he wants to control carbon for the sake of protecting our economy, and in the other, you have the president's EPA embarking on regulatory crusade that potentially would be devastating to our economy in America. The President and the EPA have been working for 4 years to build a case to justify the need for federal regulation of hydraulic fracturing. A minute ago, I listed all the things that were in his speech that I think would be devastating to the economy. One is hydraulic fracturing. I bet you 5 years ago, if you said hydraulic fracturing, people with eyes would glass over, they wouldn't know what you're talking about. They all know now, because hydraulic fracturing is a process that's used to get oil and gas out of tight formations. And I know quite a bit about it because it all started in 1949 in my state of Oklahoma. 1949, Duncan, Oklahoma. We discovered that you could unlock these reserves using hydraulic fracturing. And so it's something that has been used that way for over a million applications. And the states have been regulating it and doing so quite well. Everyone is satisfied with the way that it's been regulated, and there has never been a case. Getting back to Lisa Jackson, I asked the question in one of our committee hearings, and it was live on TV covering it. I said, can you tell me and can you identify one case in a million applications of hydraulic fracturing, one case where there has been groundwater contamination? She said she could not. So there's never been a confirmed documented case of groundwater contamination because of hydraulic fracturing. And because of these facts, the only reason the EPA regulation of hydraulic fracturing is significantly limit the use of the ban. It would kill the domestic oil and gas industry, which I believe more often than not, that's exactly what they want. Excuse me. Well, in closing, the President's remarks yesterday were not surprising to me, but it did confirm the fact that this president is not interested in pursuing an agenda that will help the growing segment of the economy, like the oil and gas industry. You know, we know people talk about our reliance upon the Middle East and people who could become our enemies for oil and gas. All we have to do is produce our own, get the political obstacles out of the way, and we can be totally independent. I would like to mention two things that President Obama has said. He says, one, that oil and gas production during his administration, his 4 years, has boomed. Well, this is true, but not in the public sector. It's done so because of hydraulic fracturing, horizontal drilling, and all these technologies that have been very successful and have worked. And again, and he's made the statement over and again that, well, it wouldn't do any good if we opened up public lands for production, because it'd take 10 years before that would affect the supply and the cost of oil and gas. Well, there's a guy whose name is Harold Hamm. Harold Hamm is arguably the most successful independent oil man in America today. He's from Enid, Oklahoma. And I called him up because I was going to be on a very liberal TV show, and I knew they were going to ask this question. So I called up so I could document an answer. And the statement they're going to say is, well, President Obama has said it'd take 10 years for oil to reach the pumps if you opened up public lands. How long do you think it would take? So I called Harold Hamm. I said, Harold, you got to be accurate in responding to this question, because I'm going to use it on national TV tonight, and I'm going to use your name. So I said, if you were to set your rig up in New Mexico and start drilling, they say, go right now, how long would it take you for the first barrel that you brought up to reach the pumps? His response was, without hesitating, he said 70 days. Not 10 years, 70 days. And then he went on and told me what would happen each day, how long it would take to go through the refining process and reach the pumps. And so, you know, that's just one of the things that's been said over and over again, because to make people believe that it's true. Let me just mention a couple of things in winding this down. Richard Lindzen is from MIT. Richard Lindzen is probably the foremost authority. No one has really questioned him in the past. He has, his statement was, regulating CO2 is a bureaucrat's dream. If you regulate CO2, you regulate life. And that's exactly what it would be. Everyone would fall into that regulation. And getting back to why this, I don't want people to sit around and worry about it. You're going to hear a lot of talk, and the president's going to do all he can under regulations to try to do cap and trade. We found out, and it took a lot of extensive research, that the president in his first 4 years has actually spent $68.4 billion on cap and trade, and that was not authorized. So he can do a lot of it through regulation, but it's not going to pass. And the reason it's not going to pass is that, as we've stated, the cost would be extensive and what would be accomplished. Again, going back, and I asked the question of the administrator of the EPA, Lisa Jackson, in another hearing. I said, if we were to pass any of the regulations, any of the legislation, the Waxman-Markey legislation, or any of the rest of them, would this reduce CO2 worldwide emissions? She said, no, it wouldn't. She said, because the problem is not here in the United States. The problem is in China, in India, in Mexico, and other places. So you could carry that argument even further. If we were to do this in just the United States, if you were one of those who really believe that CO2 emissions are causing all these problems, which I don't agree with, but if you really believe that, it still wouldn't reduce them. It would actually have the effect of increasing it. Because as we chase away our manufacturing base, because we can't generate the electricity to sustain them, where do they go? They go to countries like China and India, Mexico, and other countries where they have little or no emissions regulations. So with that, while it sounded real good yesterday in this speech, and I do have a great deal of respect for the president and his persuasive abilities, I want people to realize, those who are out there recognizing that we can become independent in our energy development in this country, that they're not going to be able to pass cap and trade any more now than they have failed to do so in the last 10 years. And with that, I yield the floor and suggest the absence of quorum.